Welcome to Thueringer for Farming Simulator 15. We now continue with our read of My Antonia by Willa Cather in Book 1, Part 14. Ambrose, Jake said, showed more human feeling than he would have supposed him capable of, but he was chiefly concerned about getting a priest and about his father's soul, which he believed was in a place of torment and would remain there until his family and the priest had prayed a great deal for him. As I understand it, Jake concluded, it will be a matter of years to pray his soul out of purgatory, and right now he's in torment. I don't believe it, I said stoutly. I almost know it isn't true. I did not, of course, say that I believed he had been in that very kitchen all afternoon on his way back to his own country. Nevertheless, after I went to bed, this idea of punishment and purgatory came back to me crushingly. I remembered the account of Dives in torment and shuddered. But Mr. Shimerda had not been rich and selfish. He had only been so unhappy that he could not live any longer. Part 15. Otto Fuchs got back from Blackhawk at noon the next day. He reported that the coroner would reach the Shimerdases sometime that afternoon, but the missionary priest was at the other end of his parish, 100 miles away, and the trains were not running. Fuchs had got a few hours' sleep at the livery barn in town, but he was afraid the gray gelding had strained himself. Indeed, he was never the same horse afterward. That long trip through the deep snow had taken all the endurance out of him. Fuchs brought home with him a stranger, a young bohemian who had taken a homestead near Black Hawk and who came on his only horse to help his fellow countrymen in their trouble. That was the first time I ever saw Anton Jelinek. He was a strapping young fellow in the early 20s then, handsome, warm-hearted, and full of life, and he came to us like a miracle in the midst of that grim business. I remember exactly how he strode into our kitchen in his felt boots and long wolfskin coat, his eyes and cheeks bright with the cold. At sight of grandmother, he snatched off his fur cap, greeting her in a deep, rolling voice, which seemed older than he. I want to thank you very much, Mrs. Burden, for that you are so kind to poor strangers from my country. He did not hesitate like a farmer boy, but looked one eagerly in the eye when he spoke. Everything about him was warm and spontaneous. He said he would have come to see the Shimerdases before, but he had hired out to husk corn all the fall, and since winter began, he had been going to the school by the mill to learn English, along with the little children. He told me he had a nice lady teacher and that he liked to go to school. At dinner, grandfather talked to Jelinek more than he usually did to strangers. Will they be much disappointed because we cannot get a priest? He asked. Jelinek looked serious. Yes, sir. That is very bad for them. Their father has done a great sin. He looked straight at grandfather. Our Lord has said that. Grandfather seemed to like his frankness. We believe that too, Jelinek, but we believe that Mr. Shimerda's soul will come to its creator as well off without a priest. We believe that Christ is our only intercessor. The young man shook his head. I know how you think. My teacher at school has explained, but I have seen too much. I believe in prayer for the dead. I have seen too much. We asked him what he meant. He glanced around the table. You want I shall tell you? When I was a little boy like this one, I began to help the priest at the altar. I made my first communion very young. What the church teach seemed plain to me. By and by, war times come when the Prussians fight us. We have very many soldiers in camp near my village, and the cholera break out that camp, and men die like flies. All day long our priests go about the air to give the sacrament to dying men, and I go with him to carry the vessels with the holy sacrament. Everybody that go near that camp catch the sickness, but me and the priest. But we have no sickness, we have no fear, because we carry that blood in the body of Christ, and it preserves us. He paused, looking at grandfather. That I know, Mr. Burden, for it happened to myself. All the soldiers know too. When we walk along the road, the old priest and me, we meet all the time. Soldiers marching and officers on horse. All those officers, when they see what I carry under the cloth, pull up their horses and kneel down on the ground in the road till we pass. So I feel very bad for my countryman to die without the sacrament, and to die in a bad way for his soul, and I feel sad for his family. We had listened attentively. It was impossible not to admire his frank, manly faith. I am always glad to meet a young man who thinks seriously about these things, said grandfather, and I would never be the one to say you were not in God's care when you were among the soldiers. After dinner, it was decided the young Jelinek should hook our two strong black farm horses to the scraper and break a road through to the Chimerdas, so that a wagon could go when it was necessary. Fuchs, who was the only cabinet maker in the neighborhood, was set to work on a coffin. Jelinek put on his long wolfskin coat, and when we admired it, he told us that he had shot and skinned the coyotes, and the young man who batched with him, Jan Buska, who had been a fur worker in Vienna, made the coat. From the windmill, I watched Jelinek come out of the barn with the blacks and work his way up the hillside toward the cornfield. Sometimes he was completely hidden by the clouds of snow that rose about him, and he and the horses would emerge black and shining. Our heavy carpenter's bench had to be brought from the barn and carried down into the kitchen. Fuchs selected boards from a pile of planks grandfather had hauled out from town in the fall to make a new floor for the oats bin. When at last the lumber and tools were assembled, and the doors were closed again and the cold drafts shut out, grandfather rode away to meet the coroner at the Chimerdas, and Fuchs took off his coat and settled down to work. I sat on his work table and watched him. He did not touch his tools at first, but figured for a long while on a piece of paper, and measured the planks and made marks on them. While he was thus engaged, he whistled softly to himself or teasingly pulled at his half ear. Grandmother moved about quietly so as not to disturb him. At last he folded his ruler and turned a cheerful face to us. The hardest part of my job's done, he announced. It's the head end of it that comes hard with me, especially when I'm out of practice. The last time I made one of these, Mrs. Burden, he continued, as he sorted and tried his chisels, was for a fellow in the Black Tiger mine up above Silverton, Colorado. The mouth of that mine goes right into the face of the cliff, and they used to put us in a bucket and run us over on a trolley and shoot us into the shaft. The bucket traveled across a box canyon 300 feet deep, and then about a third full of water. 2 Swedes had fell out of that bucket once and hit the water feet down. If you'll believe it, they went to work the next day. You can't kill a Swede. But in my time, a little Italian tried the high dive, and it turned out different with him. We was snowed in then, like we are now, and I happened to be the only man in camp that could make a coffin for him. It's a handy thing to know when you knock about like I've done. We'd be hard put to it now if you didn't know, Otto, grandmother said. Yes, ma'am, Fuchs admitted with modest pride. So few folks does know how to make a good tight box that'll turn water. I sometimes wonder if there'll be anybody about to do it for me. However, I'm not at all particular that way. All afternoon, whenever one went into the house, one could hear the panting wheeze of the saw or the pleasant purring of the plane. They were such cheerful noises, seeming to promise new things for living people. It was a pity that those fresh planed pine boards were to be put underground so soon. The lumber was hard to work because it was full of frost, and the boards gave off a sweet smell of pine woods as the heap of yellow shavings grew higher and higher. I wondered why Fuchs had not stuck to cabinet work. He settled down to it with such ease and content. He handled the tools as if he liked the feel of them, and when he planned, his hands went back and forth over the boards in an eager, beneficent way as if he were blessing them. He broke out now and then into German hymns as if this occupation brought back old times to him. At 4 o'clock, Mr. Bushy, the postmaster, with another neighbor who lived east of us, stopped in to get warm. They were on their way to the Chimerdises. The news of what had happened over there had somehow got abroad through the snow-blocked country. Grandmother gave the visitors sugar cakes and hot coffee. Before these callers were gone, the brother of the widow Stevens, who lived on the Black Hawk Road, drew up at our door, and after him came the father of the German family, our nearest neighbors on the south. They dismounted and joined us in the dining room. They were all eager for any details about the suicide, and they were greatly concerned as to where Mr. Shimerda would be buried. The nearest Catholic cemetery was at Black Hawk, and it might be weeks before a wagon could get so far. Besides, Mr. Bushy and grandmother were sure that a man who had killed himself could not be buried in a Catholic graveyard. There was a burying ground over by the Norwegian church west of Squaw Creek. Perhaps the Norwegians would take Mr. Shimerda in. After our visitors rode away in single file over the hill, we returned to the kitchen. Grandmother began to make the icing for a chocolate cake, and Otto again filled the house with the exciting, expectant song of the plane. One pleasant thing about this time was that everybody talked more than usual. I had never heard the postmaster say anything but, "Only papers today," or "I've got a sack full of mail for ye," until this afternoon. Grandmother always talked, dear woman, to herself or to the Lord if there was no one else to listen. But grandfather was naturally taciturn, and Jake and Otto were often so tired after supper that I used to feel as if I were surrounded by a wall of silence. Now everyone seemed eager to talk. That afternoon, Fuchs told me story after story about the Black Tiger mine and about violent deaths and casual buryings and the queer fancies of dying men. You never really knew a man, he said, until you saw him die. Most men were game and went without a grudge. The postmaster, going home, stopped to say the grandfather would bring the coroner back with him to spend the night. The officers of the Norwegian church, he told us, had held a meeting and decided that the Norwegian graveyard could not extend its hospitality to Mr. Shimerda. Grandmother was indignant. "If these foreigners are so clannish, Mr. Bushy, I'll have to have an American graveyard that will be more liberal-minded. I'll get right after Josiah to start one in the spring. If anything was to happen to me, I don't want the Norwegians holding inquisitions over me to see whether I'm good enough to be laid amongst them." Soon grandfather returned, bringing with him Anton Jelinek and that important person, the coroner. He was a mild, flurried old man, a Civil War veteran with one sleeve hanging empty. He seemed to find this case very perplexing, and said if it had not been for grandfather, he would have sworn out a warrant against Grajiek. The way he acted and the way his axe fit the wound was enough to convict any man. Although it was perfectly clear that Mr. Shimerda had killed himself, Jake and the coroner thought something ought to be done to Krajiek because he behaved like a guilty man. He was badly frightened, certainly, and perhaps he even felt some stirrings of remorse for his indifference to the old man's misery and loneliness. At supper, the men ate like Vikings, and the chocolate cake, which I had hoped would linger on until tomorrow in a mutilated condition, disappeared on the second round. They talked excitedly about where they would bury Mr. Shimerda. I gathered that the neighbors were all disturbed and shocked about something. It developed that Mrs. Shimerda and Ambrose wanted the old man buried on the southwest corner of their own land. Indeed, under the very stake that marked the corner. Grandfather had explained to Ambrose that some day when the country was put under fence and the roads were confined to section lines, two roads would cross exactly on that corner. But Ambrose only said it makes no matter. Grandfather asked Jelinek whether in the old country there was some superstition to the effect that a suicide must be buried at the crossroads. Jelinek said he didn't know. He seemed to remember hearing there had once been such a custom in Bohemia. Mrs. Shimerda is made up her mind, he added. I try to persuade her and say it looks bad for her to all the neighbors, but she says so it must be. There I will bury him if I dig the grave myself, she say. I have promised her I help Ambrose make the grave tomorrow. Grandfather smoothed his beard and looked judicial. I don't know whose wish should decide the matter if not hers, but if she thinks she will live to see the people of this country ride over that old man's head, she is mistaken. Part 16. Mr. Shimerda lay dead in the barn 4 days, and on the 5th they buried him. All day Friday, Jelinek was off with Ambrose digging the grave, chopping out the frozen earth with old axes. On Saturday, we breakfasted before daylight and got into the wagon with the coffin. Jake and Jelinek went ahead on horseback to cut the body loose from the pool of blood in which it was frozen fast to the ground. When grandmother and I went into the Shimerdas' house, we found the women folk alone. Ambrose and Merrick were at the barn. Mrs. Shimerda sat crouching by the stove. Antonia was washing dishes. When she saw me, she ran out of her dark corner and threw her arms about me. "Oh, Jimmy," she sobbed, "what you think for my lovely papa?" It seemed to me that I could feel her heart breaking as she clung to me. Mrs. Shimerda, sitting on the stump by the stove, kept looking over her shoulder toward the door while the neighbors were arriving. They came on horseback, all except the postmaster who brought his family in a wagon over the only broken wagon trail. The widow Stevens rode up from her farm 8 miles down the Black Hawk Road. The cold drove the women into the cave house, and it was soon crowded. A fine, sleety snow was beginning to fall, and everyone was afraid of another storm and anxious to have the burial over with. Grandfather and Jelinek came to tell Mrs. Shimerda that it was time to start. After bundling her mother up in clothes the neighbors had brought, Antonia put on an old cape from our house and the rabbit skin hat her father had made for her. 4 men carried Mr. Shimerdas' box up the hill. Krajiek slunk along behind them. The coffin was too wide for the door, so it was put down on the slope outside. I slipped out from the cave and looked at Mr. Shimerda. He was lying on his side with his knees drawn up. His body was draped in a black shawl and his head was bandaged in white muslin, like a mummy's. One of his long, shapely hands lay out on the black cloth. That was all one could see of him. Mrs. Shimerda came out and placed an open prayer book against the body, making the sign of the cross on the bandaged head with her fingers. Ambrose knelt down and made the same gesture, and after him Antonia and Merrick. Julka hung back. Her mother pushed her forward and kept saying something to her over and over. Julka knelt down, shut her eyes, and put out her hand a little way, but she drew it back and began to cry wildly. She was afraid to touch the bandage. Mrs. Shimerda caught her by the shoulders and pushed her toward the coffin, but grandmother interfered. No, Mrs. Shimerda, she said firmly, I won't stand by and see that child frightened into spasms. She is too little to understand what you want of her. Let her alone. At a look from grandfather, Fuchs and Jelinek placed the lid on the box and began to nail it down over Mr. Shimerda. I was afraid to look at Antonia. She put her arms around Julka and held the little girl close to her. The coffin was put into the wagon. We drove slowly away against the fine icy snow which cut our faces like a sandblast. When we reached the grave, it looked a very little spot in that snow-covered waste. The men took the coffin to the edge of the hole and lowered it with ropes. We stood about watching them, and the powdery snow lay without melting on the caps and shoulders of the men and the shawls of the women. Jelinek spoke in a persuasive tone to Mrs. Shimerda and then turned to grandfather. She says, Mr. Burton, she is very glad if you can make some prayer for him here in English, for the neighbors to understand. Grandmother looked anxiously at grandfather. He took off his hat, and the other man did likewise. I thought his prayer remarkable. I still remember it. He began, O great and just God, no man among us knows what the sleeper knows, nor is it for us to judge what lies between him and thee. He prayed that if any man there had been remiss toward the stranger come to a far country, God would forgive him and soften his heart. He recalled the promises to the widow and the fatherless and asked God to smooth the way before this widow and her children, and to incline the hearts of men to deal justly with her. In closing, he said, we were leaving Mr. Shimerda at thy judgment seat, which is also thy mercy seat. All the time he was praying, grandmother watched him through the black fingers of her glove, and when he said amen, I thought she looked satisfied with him. She turned to Otto and whispered, Can't you start a hymn, Fuchs? It would seem less heathenish. Fuchs glanced about to see if there was general approval of her suggestion, and began, Jesus, lover of my soul, and all the men and women took it up after him. Whenever I have heard the hymn since, it has made me remember that white waste and the little group of people, and the bluish air full of fine eddying snow like long veils flying. While the nearer waters roll, while the tempest still is high, years afterward, when the open grazing days were over, and the red grass had been plowed under and under until it had almost disappeared from the prairie, when all the fields were under fence, and the roads no longer ran about like wild things, but followed the surveyed section lines, Mr. Shimerda's grave was still there, with a sagging wire fence around it, and an unpainted wooden cross. As grandfather had predicted, Mrs. Shimerda never saw the roads going over his head. The road from the north curved a little to the east just there, and the road from the west swung out a little to the south, so that the grave, with its tall red grass that was never mowed, was like a little island, and at twilight, under a new moon or the clear evening star, the dusty roads used to look like soft gray rivers flowing past it. I never came upon the place without emotion, and in all that country it was the spot most dear to me. I love the dim superstition and the propitiatory intent that had put the grave there, and still more I love the spirit that could not carry out the sentence, the error from the surveyed lines, the clemency of the soft earth roads along which the homecoming wagons rattled after sunset. Never a tired driver passed the wooden cross, I am sure, without wishing well to the sleeper. Part 17. When spring came after that hard winter, one could not get enough of the nimble air. Every morning I awakened with a fresh consciousness that winter was over. There were none of the signs of spring for which I used to watch in Virginia. No budding woods or blooming gardens. There was only spring itself, the throb of it, the light restlessness, the vital essence of it everywhere, in the sky, in the swift clouds, in the pale sunshine, and in the warm, high wind rising suddenly, sinking suddenly, impulsive and playful, like a big puppy that pawed you and then laid down to be petted. If I had been tossed down blindfold on that red prairie, I should have known that it was spring. Everywhere now there was the smell of burning grass. Our neighbors burned off their pasture before the new grass made a start, so that the fresh growth would not be mixed with the dead stand of last year. Those light, swift fires running about the country seemed a part of the same kindling that was in the air. The Chimerdas were in their new log house by then. The neighbors had helped them to build it in March. It stood directly in front of their old cave, which they used as a cellar. The family were now fairly equipped to begin their struggle with the soil. They had 4 comfortable rooms to live in, a new windmill bought on credit, a chicken house, and poultry. Mrs. Chimerda had paid grandfather $10 for a milk cow and was to give him 15 more as soon as they harvested their first crop. When I rode up to the Chimerdas one bright, windy afternoon in April, Jolka ran out to meet me. It was to her now that I gave reading lessons. Antonia was busy with other things. I tied my pony and went into the kitchen where Mrs. Chimerda was baking bread, chewing poppy seeds as she worked. By this time she could speak enough English to ask me a great many questions about what our men were doing in the fields. She seemed to think that my elders withheld helpful information, and that from me she might get valuable secrets. On this occasion she asked me very craftily when grandfather expected to begin planting corn. I told her, adding that he thought we should have a dry spring and that the corn would not be held back by too much rain, as it had been last year. She gave me a shrewd glance. "He not Jesus," she blustered. "He not know about the wet and the dry." I did not answer her. What was the use? As I sat waiting for the hour when Ambrosch and Antonia would return from the fields, I watched Mrs. Chimerda at her work. She took from the oven a coffee cake which she wanted to keep warm for supper and wrapped it in a quilt stuffed with feathers. I have seen her put even a roast goose in this quilt to keep it hot. When the neighbors were there, building the new house, they saw her do this, and the story got abroad that the Chimerdas kept their food in their feather beds. When the sun was dropping low, Antonia came up the big south draw with her team. How much older she had grown in 8 months! She had come to us a child, and now she was a tall, strong young girl, although her 15th birthday had just slipped by. I ran out and met her as she brought her horses up to the windmill to water them. She wore the boots her father had so thoughtfully taken off before he shot himself, and as old for her cap. Her outgrown cotton dress switched about her calves over the boot tops. She kept her sleeves rolled up all day, and her arms and throat were burned as brown as a sailor's. Her neck came up strongly out of her shoulders, like the bole of a tree out of the turf. One sees the draft horse's neck among the peasant women in all old countries. She greeted me gaily and began at once to tell me how much plowing she had done that day. Ambrose, she said, was on the north quarter breaking sod with the oxen. Jim, you ask Jake how much he plowed today. I don't want that Jake get more done in one day than me. We won't have very much corn this fall. While the horses drew in the water and nosed each other and then drank again, Antonia sat down on the windmill step and rested her head on her hand. You see that big prairie fire from your place last night? I hope your grandpa ain't lose no stacks. No, we didn't. I came to ask you something, Tony. Grandmother wants to know if you can't go to the term of school that begins next week over at the odd schoolhouse. She says there's a good teacher and you'd learn a lot. Antonia stood up, lifting and dropping her shoulders as if they were stiff. I ain't got time to learn. I can work like mans now. My mother say no more how Ambrose do all and nobody help him. I can work as much as him.